Between 1847 and 1851, 7 plantation owners across eastern Georgia were attacked in their beds by their own hunting dogs. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses who would speak. But investigators discovered something that terrified every slaveholder in the region. The dogs had been systematically retrained. Their loyalty transferred to someone who understood their nature better than those who claimed to own them. His name appeared in whispered testimony simply as Marcus, a field hand who had weaponized the very instruments of control meant to enforce slavery's brutal order. Tonight, we uncover how one man turned the tools of oppression against their masters. Before we continue with the story of Marcus and the summer that shattered Georgia's illusion of absolute control, I need you to do something. If stories like this one, dark chapters of resistance that history tried to bury, fascinate you as much as they haunt me, hit that subscribe button right now. And here's something I'm curious about. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your state or city in the comments below. I want to know how far these forgotten American acts of defiance reach. The pattern of violence. In the spring of 1849, the plantation economy of eastern Georgia operated with the mechanical certainty that its architects believed would last forever. Cotton prices remained stable, labor was extracted with brutal efficiency, and the social order that elevated some while crushing others seemed immutable as the red clay soil itself. But beneath the surface of this carefully maintained world, something was shifting. Dogs that had been trained for generations to hunt human beings were beginning to refuse their commands. Livestock guardian breeds that had once attacked on sight were sitting motionless when runaways passed within feet of their positions. The first incident that drew official attention occurred on April 14th at the Henderson Plantation, 12 miles east of Augusta. Benjamin Henderson, a man who had inherited 4,200 acres and 180 enslaved people from his father, was found in his office at dawn with both hands mangled beyond surgical repair. His 2 bloodhounds, animals he had personally trained since they were puppies, stood guard at his door, preventing anyone from entering until the county doctor arrived hours later. The dogs showed no signs of rabies, no evidence of external agitation. They had simply performed an act of calculated violence and then returned to their positions as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. What made the Henderson incident particularly disturbing to those who investigated it was the precision of the injuries. The dogs had not killed their master, though they certainly possessed the capability. They had not attacked his face or throat, though those would have been natural targets for animals trained in aggression. Instead, they had systematically disabled his hands, the instruments through which he signed bills of sale, wrote entries in his leather-bound ledgers documenting the punishment of enslaved workers, and wielded the riding crop he carried during his daily inspections of the cotton fields. Within 3 weeks, 2 more plantation owners reported similar attacks. James Whitfield of Whitfield Manor lost the use of his right leg, tendons severed with surgical precision by his own mastiffs. Robert Cunningham of Riverside Estate required amputation of his left arm after his guard dogs cornered him in the stable and held him there for 6 hours, their teeth applying just enough pressure to cause devastating damage without triggering the blood loss that would have brought immediate death. The pattern was undeniable. The attacks occurred between midnight and dawn. They always involved dogs that had lived on the plantation for years, animals considered absolutely reliable. The injuries were severe enough to permanently disable, but not kill. And in each case, enslaved workers questioned by investigators claimed to have seen and heard nothing, maintaining a silence that was itself a form of testimony about who they believed was truly responsible. The arrival at Thornfield Estate. Marcus arrived at Thornfield Estate on March 12, 1849, purchased at a Savannah auction for $850, a price that reflected his physical strength but failed to account for the intelligence that made him dangerous. He was 28 years old, tall enough to draw attention, quiet enough to seem compliant. The bill of sale listed him simply as field hand, good health, no known defects. But what it did not mention were the 4 previous plantations that had sold him within months of purchase, each one citing vague concerns about his influence on other enslaved workers and unexplained incidents involving their guard dogs. Colonel Harrison Thornfield had not wanted to purchase Marcus, actually. His usual practice was to buy enslaved people in family groups, believing that the presence of wives and children made men more manageable, less likely to risk punishment or escape when such actions would bring suffering to those they loved. But his head overseer, James Whitmore, had convinced him that they needed additional labor for the spring planting, and Marcus had been the strongest worker available at the auction that day. The auctioneer, a florid man named Silas Pemberton, had praised Marcus's work ethic, while carefully avoiding any mention of his previous owner's reasons for selling him. The journey from Savannah to Thornfield took 2 days by wagon. Marcus chained alongside 3 other newly purchased workers. He spoke little during the journey, observing the landscape, noting the locations of waterways and dense forest, cataloging information that might prove useful later. The other enslaved people in the wagon tried to engage him in conversation, seeking the comfort of human connection in their shared terror. But Marcus remained largely silent. He was not cruel in his silence, not dismissive, simply conserving his energy and his attention for what he knew was coming. When they arrived at Thornfield, Marcus was processed through the plantation's intake procedures with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. His clothing was exchanged for the rough Osnaburg fabric that marked enslaved workers on the estate. His name was entered into Colonel Thornfield's ledger alongside his purchase price and a brief physical description. He was assigned to a cabin in the quarters, given a thin blanket and a wooden bowl, and told he would begin work in the cotton fields the following morning at dawn. But what Marcus noticed during those first hours at Thornfield was not the overseer's casual brutality or the exhaustion visible in the faces of workers returning from the fields. What caught his attention was the kennel yard visible from the quarters, where a dozen dogs paced behind wooden fencing. He watched how they moved, how they responded to the kennel keeper's commands, how they established hierarchy among themselves through posture and breath rather than violence. And he understood that Thornfield Estate, like the 4 plantations before it, had built its system of control on animals that could be taught a different kind of loyalty. The architecture of control. Thornfield Estate relied on 12 dogs to maintain its boundaries and enforce its brutal order. Bloodhounds trained to track human scent across miles of wilderness, mastiffs bred for aggression and size, curs that could work all day without tiring. These animals represented a crucial component of the plantation's infrastructure of terror, as important as the whip or the auction block in maintaining the fiction of absolute power. Colonel Harrison Thornfield had invested thousands of dollars in breeding programs and training regimens, creating what he believed was an impenetrable living fence around his 6,000 acres. The breeding program had begun with Colonel Thornfield's father, Jonathan Thornfield, who had purchased his first bloodhound breeding pair from a South Carolina planter in 1808. Over 4 decades, the Thornfield family had refined their lines, selecting for scenting ability, stamina, and, most importantly, a willingness to pursue and attack human targets without hesitation. These were not animals kept as companions or pets. They were weapons, maintained and deployed with the same calculated efficiency as the rifles stored in the plantation's armory. The training process began when puppies reached 8 weeks of age. They were introduced to human scent through a carefully designed progression that conditioned them to associate the smell of enslaved workers with pursuit and reward. Young dogs were taught to follow scent trails laid by enslaved workers who were promised lighter duties in exchange for their participation. As the dogs matured, the training intensified, incorporating longer distances, more challenging terrain, and eventually live pursuit scenarios where the dogs learned to corner and hold human targets until their handlers arrived. Colonel Thornfield maintained detailed records of each dog's lineage, training progress, and performance in actual pursuits. His leather-bound kennel journal documented 47 successful pursuits of escaped enslaved workers over the past 6 years, with notes about which dogs had performed best under various conditions. He consulted with other plantation owners about training techniques, traded breeding stock to improve his lines, and took considerable pride in the reputation his dogs had earned throughout eastern Georgia as the finest hunting animals in the region. The kennel facilities themselves reflected this investment. The dogs lived in a wooden structure built specifically for their housing, with individual stalls that could be closed for separation or open to allow the pack to interact. The building featured a raised floor to keep the dogs dry during Georgia's humid summers, proper ventilation to prevent disease, and a secure exercise yard where they could be worked without risk of escape. Silas Webb, the kennel keeper, lived in a small cabin adjacent to the dog quarters, his entire existence dedicated to maintaining the health and readiness of animals he both feared and depended upon for his employment. But what neither Colonel Thornfield nor Silas Webb understood was that the very sophistication of their system created vulnerabilities. The dogs were intelligent, capable of learning complex behaviors and forming strong bonds. They responded not just to commands, but to the emotional states of those who handled them. And in their focus on training the dogs to attack, they had never considered what might happen if someone taught them with patience instead of punishment, with understanding instead of brutality. First contact. Marcus's first interaction with the dogs occurred on his 3rd day at Thornfield, when he was assigned to deliver water to the field crews working the furthest cotton sections. The path required passing the kennel yard where the hunting dogs were kept chained during daylight hours, an area enslaved workers typically navigated with fear, keeping their eyes down and their movements quick. But Marcus stopped at the fence line. He stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, making no sound, offering no gesture, simply observing the animals with an intensity that the kennel keeper, a poor white man named Silas Webb, found unsettling enough to mention to the overseer. The dogs, in turn, observed Marcus. They did not bark or growl, did not rush the fence in the aggressive display they typically showed when enslaved workers passed nearby. Instead, they sat or stood at various distances, their attention focused on this stranger, who refused to exhibit the fear they had been trained to expect. The largest of the bloodhounds, a male named Brutus that weighed nearly 110 pounds, moved closer to the fence, his massive head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand what made this human different from all the others who hurried past in terror. Silas Webb watched this interaction from the kennel door, a plug of tobacco distorting his cheek, his hands resting on the wooden rail that separated him from the yard. He did not call out to Marcus or order him to move along, though that would have been within his authority. Something about the moment held him silent, watching as man and dogs conducted their wordless communication. Webb had worked with hunting dogs for 15 years, first for his father in South Carolina, and then for Colonel Thornfield. He prided himself on understanding canine behavior, on being able to predict how dogs would respond to various stimuli. But what he witnessed in that moment disturbed him, because it defied everything he thought he knew. Marcus finally moved, not hurriedly, but with the same deliberate calm he had maintained throughout. He continued down the path toward the distant cotton fields, the water buckets balanced across his shoulders, his gait steady and unhurried. Behind him, the dogs remained quiet, watching until he disappeared from view. Only then did they return to their normal behaviors, pacing and panting in the afternoon heat, waiting for the evening feeding that would temporarily satisfy their hunger. That night, Silas Webb mentioned the incident to James Whitmore, the head overseer. "That new buck, the one you bought in Savannah, there's something peculiar about him," Webb said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "The dogs acted strange when he stopped by the kennel, too quiet, too interested." Whitmore, who had his own suspicions about Marcus, filed this information away in his mental catalog of concerns. But he did not act on it immediately. After all, what could an enslaved man possibly do to subvert the will of trained hunting dogs? The very idea seemed absurd, born of Webb's wounded pride that his animals had shown interest in someone other than their designated keeper. The language of animals. What Marcus understood, what he had learned through years of observation across multiple plantations, was that dogs were not simple instruments of oppression, but complex beings with their own hierarchies, fears, and desires. He had studied how they communicated through posture and breath, how they established dominance not through aggression but through confidence and stillness. He knew that the violence they were trained to perform against enslaved people was not instinctive but taught, and therefore could be untaught by someone who spoke their language more fluently than their supposed masters. And Marcus's education in animal behavior had begun in childhood, before the auction block, before the Middle Passage, before the forced separation from everything and everyone he had known. In the village where he had been born, dogs served as guardians and companions, living alongside humans in relationships built on mutual benefit rather than forced submission. He had learned from his grandmother, a woman whose knowledge of animals had earned her respect throughout the region, that dogs responded to confidence more than commands, to consistency more than cruelty. She had taught him to read the subtle signals that preceded barking or biting, to recognize the difference between fear-based aggression and genuine threat, to understand that animals, like people, made choices about loyalty based on how they were treated. When Marcus had been captured at age 14 and forced onto the ship that would carry him across the Atlantic, he had believed that knowledge would die with the world he was leaving behind. But in the decades since, on 5 different plantations across Georgia and South Carolina, he had discovered that the principles his grandmother taught applied to American hunting dogs as surely as they had to the village guardians of his childhood. Dogs everywhere sought leadership, consistency, and fair treatment. They formed bonds with those who understood their nature, and they could distinguish between humans who saw them as tools and humans who saw them as beings worthy of respect. The specific techniques Marcus employed were both simple and sophisticated. He never approached dogs directly or made sudden movements that might trigger their defensive instincts. He used his peripheral vision to monitor their body language without direct eye contact, that they might interpret as challenge or threat. He controlled his breathing and heart rate, understanding that dogs could detect anxiety through chemical signals that humans could not consciously perceive. And most importantly, he was patient, willing to spend weeks or months earning trust that others demanded instantly through force. At his previous plantations, Marcus had experimented with these methods carefully, testing how far he could push without drawing attention that would bring punishment or sale. At the Cunningham estate in South Carolina, he had befriended the kennel dogs by sharing portions of his already inadequate food rations, establishing himself as a source of unexpected kindness. At the Morrison plantation outside Savannah, he had learned that dogs responded to specific tonal patterns in human speech, that a low, steady vocalization could calm even the most agitated animal. Each plantation had taught him something new, refined his understanding, prepared him for what he now planned to accomplish at Thornfield Estate. But Marcus's knowledge extended beyond mere technique. He understood the psychology of oppression, how it damaged not just the enslaved, but also the instruments used to enforce their enslavement. The dogs at Thornfield, like those at every plantation, lived in a state of controlled deprivation. They were kept hungry enough to be motivated by food rewards, isolated enough to be desperate for social connection, and punished harshly enough when they failed, that they performed their brutal work through fear as much as training. Marcus recognized this as another form of slavery, different in degree but not in kind from his own bondage, and he understood that liberation for himself required liberation for the animals used to imprison him. The Kennel Keeper's Complaint. By the end of Marcus's first month at Thornfield, Silas Webb made his third complaint to the overseer about the new field hand's behavior around the dogs. The animals were becoming less responsive to commands, more agitated during training sessions, refusing food from Webb's hands while eating readily when Marcus was anywhere near the kennel yard. Webb insisted that Marcus must be using some kind of conjure, some African magic that gave him supernatural influence over the dogs, a claim that the overseer dismissed as superstition, born of wounded pride that his animals preferred a slave to their designated keeper. The first complaint had come on March 28th, 2 weeks after Marcus's arrival. Webb had observed Marcus again stopping near the kennel during his daily water delivery route, this time for nearly 10 minutes. The dogs had gathered at the fence, silent and attentive, and Webb swore he had seen Marcus's lips moving as if speaking to the animals, though he had been too far away to hear actual words. When Webb approached to order Marcus back to his duties, the dogs had turned on him with unusual aggression, forcing him to retreat until Marcus moved away, and the animals calmed. The second complaint followed an incident during training exercises. Webb had been working with Brutus, the lead bloodhound, practicing pursuit commands using a scent trail laid by one of the house servants. But Brutus had refused to follow the trail, instead sitting motionless at the starting point and whining, his attention directed toward the distant cotton fields where Marcus was working. No amount of encouragement or punishment could motivate the dog to perform. Webb had been forced to abandon the training session, marking it in his log as a failure, his first in nearly 3 years of maintaining Colonel Thornfield's hunting pack. The third complaint was the most serious. Webb claimed he had discovered evidence that someone was visiting the kennels at night, leaving food that contradicted the carefully controlled feeding schedule designed to keep the dogs hungry enough to pursue human targets with maximum motivation. The food was of poor quality: cornmeal, potato peelings, scraps that could only have come from the enslaved workers' rations. But its presence represented a fundamental violation of the kennel's security and a direct challenge to Webb's authority over his animals. James Whitmore had listened to each complaint with increasing irritation, not at Marcus, but at Webb himself. The overseer considered the kennel keeper a necessary employee, but not a particularly intelligent one, the kind of poor white man who clung to his marginal authority over enslaved people because it was the only power he would ever possess. Whitmore suspected that Webb's complaints stemmed from jealousy that his dog showed interest in someone else, combined with the kind of superstitious thinking common among uneducated whites who attributed any unexplained phenomenon to African magic or witchcraft. Nevertheless, Whitmore filed reports about Webb's concerns in the plantation's daily log, noting dates and alleged incidents. He did this not because he believed Marcus posed any real threat, but because thoroughness in documentation protected him if something went wrong. If the dogs failed during an actual pursuit, if a valuable piece of property escaped because the hunting pack proved unreliable, Whitmore wanted evidence that he had monitored the situation and reported unusual behavior. In the careful calculus of plantation management, covering one's own position always took precedence over investigating the complaints of a kennel keeper, whose primary qualification was his willingness to work with animals that frightened most white men. Night lessons. What no one at Thornfield knew was that Marcus had begun visiting the kennels after midnight, moving through the darkness with the practiced silence of someone who had learned that survival often required invisibility. The dogs did not bark at his approach. They waited, alert but calm, as he slipped past the main house where Colonel Thornfield slept, surrounded by his wealth and his weapons, and his certainty that both would protect him. In these stolen hours, Marcus taught the dogs new commands, new loyalties, rewiring years of brutal conditioning with patience and an understanding of animal psychology that was itself an act of resistance. The path from the slave quarters to the kennels required crossing 200 yards of open ground that was theoretically visible from the main house, though in practice the night watch consisted of one elderly enslaved man whose primary job was to ring the bell at dawn, rather than maintain actual security. Marcus had studied the watch patterns for his first week at Thornfield, noting that the watchman typically fell asleep around midnight and did not wake until the eastern sky began to lighten. This window of 4 to 5 hours provided enough time for the careful work Marcus needed to accomplish. The first night he approached the kennels, Marcus carried nothing but scraps from his own inadequate dinner: a handful of cornmeal, a few pieces of salt pork fat that he had saved rather than eaten. He moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen and observe, ensuring that no one else was awake and moving in the darkness. When he reached the kennel fence, he simply sat down in the dirt, making himself as non-threatening as possible, and waited for the dogs to approach on their own terms. Brutus came first, the massive bloodhound moving to the fence with his characteristic dignity, his head lowered to catch Marcus's scent. Behind him, the other dogs watched from various distances, their natural caution warring with curiosity about this human who appeared during their sleeping hours without aggression or fear. Marcus extended his hand slowly, palm up, allowing Brutus to investigate thoroughly. The dog's wet nose explored Marcus's fingers, his wrist, reading the chemical story of where Marcus had been and what he had eaten, and what his emotional state might be. After perhaps 10 minutes of this mutual investigation, Marcus pulled out one of the small pieces of salt pork fat and offered it to Brutus. Not thrown, not placed on the ground, but held steady in his palm for the dog to take directly. Brutus accepted the food with surprising gentleness for an animal his size, and in that exchange of gift freely offered and received, the first thread of their relationship was woven. Marcus would repeat this process every night for weeks, gradually expanding his connection to include all 12 dogs in the kennel, teaching them through consistent kindness that not all humans were sources of pain or deprivation. But the food was only the beginning. What Marcus truly taught during those midnight sessions was much more fundamental. He taught the dogs new commands in a language only they understood together, soft vocalizations and hand gestures that meant safety, patience, discrimination. He taught them that they could choose whom to obey based on who treated them with respect rather than cruelty. He taught them the difference between the legitimate protection of territory and the illegitimate violence of hunting human beings who sought only freedom. And most importantly, he taught them that their power could be directed by their own will, rather than the will of men who saw them as nothing more than tools. The overseer's suspicion. James Whitmore had served as Thornfield's head overseer for 11 years, and he prided himself on his ability to identify troublemakers before they became problems. Something about Marcus worried him in ways he could not fully articulate. The man was too calm, too observant, too comfortable in his own skin for someone who should have been broken by the system that enslaved him. Whitmore began watching Marcus more closely, noting his movements, questioning other enslaved workers about his activities, searching for evidence of the rebellion he sensed brewing beneath Marcus's compliant exterior. Whitmore's suspicions were not based on any specific violation of plantation rules. Marcus performed his assigned labor without complaint, showed appropriate deference when addressed by white overseers, and caused no disturbances in the quarters that would have warranted punishment. But Whitmore had learned through years of managing enslaved labor that the absence of obvious defiance could itself be a warning sign. The truly dangerous ones, the ones who plotted escape or uprising, were rarely the hot-headed young men who talked back or dragged their feet during work. They were the quiet ones who observed more than they spoke, who measured risks carefully, who possessed the intelligence and patience to wait for the right moment. On April 12th, Whitmore assigned Marcus to work in the cotton field closest to the main house, where observation would be easier throughout the day. He instructed the field driver, an enslaved man named Samuel, who had been promoted to his position through a combination of competence and willingness to enforce discipline, to pay particular attention to Marcus's behavior and report anything unusual. But the day passed without incident. Marcus worked steadily, maintaining the same efficient pace throughout the morning and afternoon, speaking little to the other workers, drawing no attention to himself whatsoever. The following week, Whitmore tried a different approach. He arranged for Marcus to be rotated through various work assignments, one day in the cotton fields, the next hauling timber, the third cleaning the stables. The goal was to disrupt any patterns Marcus might have established, to prevent him from building relationships or making preparations that required predictability. But this strategy, too, yielded nothing concrete. Marcus adapted to each new assignment without protest, performed the work competently, and gave no indication that the constant changes bothered him in the slightest. What frustrated Whitmore most was that his own instincts about Marcus seemed impossible to justify to Colonel Thornfield. The plantation owner required evidence, not feelings, before authorizing the kind of intensive surveillance or preemptive punishment that Whitmore believed was warranted. And without Silas Webb's increasingly frantic complaints about the dogs, Whitmore had nothing to point to except his own unease, a commodity that carried little weight in plantation management decisions driven by profit calculations and labor efficiency. By late April, Whitmore had begun to question his own judgment. Perhaps Marcus was exactly what he appeared to be, an enslaved worker who had learned that survival required compliance, who kept his head down and did his work and caused no trouble. Perhaps Whitmore's suspicions said more about his own paranoia than about any genuine threat Marcus posed. But even as Whitmore entertained these doubts, he could not fully dismiss the sense that something was wrong, that beneath Thornfield's carefully maintained order, changes were occurring that no one in a position of authority had yet recognized or understood. The first demonstration. In late May, Colonel Thornfield invited 3 neighboring plantation owners to Thornfield for a demonstration of his dog's capabilities. It was a social event disguised as a practical display, an opportunity for wealthy men to compare their methods of control while drinking imported whiskey and smoking Cuban cigars. The demonstration involved releasing bloodhounds to track a volunteer runner, a young enslaved man named Peter, who was promised lighter work if he participated. But when the dogs were released, they sat motionless, refusing all commands to pursue. Their attention focused not on Peter's fleeing form, but on Marcus, who stood among the field workers watching from a distance. The afternoon of May 28th began with careful preparation. Colonel Thornfield had ordered the grounds around the main house cleared of debris, creating an open area where his guests could observe the hunt without obstruction. He had selected Peter, a 19-year-old field hand known for his speed, to serve as the quarry in a staged pursuit that would demonstrate how quickly Thornfield's bloodhounds could track and corner a running human target. Peter had been given a head start of 5 minutes, time enough to reach the pine forest at the eastern edge of the cleared fields, where he was supposed to wait to be found. The guests arrived at 3 o'clock. Samuel Cartwright from the neighboring plantation, James Madison Henderson, whose family had owned land in the region for 3 generations, and Robert Cunningham, whose estate bordered Thornfield to the south. They gathered on the main house veranda, drinks in hand, discussing cotton prices and the political situation in Washington, while Silas Webb prepared the dogs for the demonstration. Colonel Thornfield had chosen his 3 best bloodhounds for the exercise. Brutus, a female named Lady who had tracked 14 successful pursuits, and a younger male named Judge who showed exceptional promise. When everything was ready, Colonel Thornfield gave the signal. Silas Webb led the 3 bloodhounds to the spot where Peter had begun his run, allowing them to catch his scent from the disturbed earth. The dogs sniffed the ground, their tails beginning to wave with the excitement that typically preceded a pursuit. Webb unclipped their leads, expecting them to surge forward following Peter's scent trail into the forest. Instead, all three dogs sat down in perfect synchronization, as if responding to a command Webb had never given. "What in hell?" Webb pulled a strip of leather from his pocket and snapped it against his leg, producing a sharp crack that normally motivated immediate obedience. The dogs did not move. He shouted the command to pursue in English and then in the simplified German phrases he sometimes used during training. Still nothing. The dogs remained seated, their heads turned not toward the forest where Peter waited, but toward the group of enslaved workers who had been allowed to observe the demonstration from a respectful distance. Colonel Thornfield's face reddened as he descended from the veranda, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "What is wrong with them?" he demanded, his voice carrying the edge that preceded violence. Webb could only shake his head, bewildered and terrified by the implications of this failure in front of witnesses. The three visiting plantation owners exchanged glances, their expressions mixing amusement at their host's embarrassment with concern about what this failure might indicate regarding the reliability of their own hunting packs. Marcus watched from his position among the field workers, his face showing nothing but the mild curiosity appropriate for an enslaved person observing the activities of their supposed betters. But inside, he felt a fierce satisfaction. Months of midnight visits, patient relationship building, and careful training were manifesting in this public humiliation. The dogs had made their choice. They would no longer hunt people who sought freedom. The cost of failure. Colonel Thornfield's humiliation at the failed demonstration demanded punishment, and that punishment was distributed with the arbitrary cruelty that defined plantation justice. Peter was whipped for allegedly sabotaging the hunt through some unspecified means. Silas Webb was fined a month's wages for failing to maintain the dog's training, and Marcus was singled out for 20 lashes on the suspicion of using dark arts to interfere with the demonstration, a charge that had no evidence but required no evidence because the word of a black man meant nothing against the wounded pride of a white plantation owner. The punishments were carried out the following morning in the area behind the barn where such spectacles typically occurred, with all enslaved workers required to witness as a reminder of the consequences of failure or disobedience. Peter was first, his shirt removed, his wrists tied to the whipping post that had stood in that spot since the plantation's founding. The overseer, James Whitmore, administered 15 lashes with the leather strap kept specifically for this purpose, each one raising welts across Peter's back that would take weeks to heal. Peter did not cry out, knowing that any expression of pain would only extend his suffering, but his body jerked with each impact, and by the end his back was bleeding from several places where the leather had broken skin. Silas Webb's punishment was financial rather than physical, but for a poor white man who lived on the edge of destitution, even in good times, the loss of a month's wages represented a catastrophe. He would have to borrow money to eat, would fall behind on debts he already owed, would spend months digging out of the hole created by his dog's inexplicable failure. Webb knew, as everyone knew, that he was being punished not for anything he had actually done wrong, but because Colonel Thornfield needed someone to blame, and the kennel keeper's low status made him a convenient target. Marcus was brought last, and the air in the punishment ground changed when he was led to the whipping post. The other enslaved workers watched with the careful neutrality they had learned to maintain during such events, showing neither sympathy nor satisfaction, refusing to give their overseers any emotional response that might justify additional cruelty. But something in the quality of the silence suggested they understood that Marcus's punishment was different, that he was being targeted not for what he had done but for what Colonel Thornfield suspected he might be capable of doing. Colonel Thornfield himself administered Marcus's punishment, a break from usual protocol that signaled the personal nature of his anger. He did not use the standard leather strap, but instead selected a braided whip that would cut deeper, cause more severe damage. The first lash opened a line of fire across Marcus's back. The second crossed the first, creating an X pattern that would scar permanently. By the 10th lash, blood was running down Marcus's back, soaking into the waistband of his rough cotton trousers. By the 20th, his back was a landscape of torn flesh that would require weeks to heal and would never fully recover its original appearance. Through it all, Marcus did not cry out. He breathed through the pain, using techniques his grandmother had taught him decades ago for enduring the unendurable, compartmentalizing the signals his body sent to his brain, finding a place inside himself where the whip could not reach. He understood that this punishment was a kind of admission from Colonel Thornfield, an acknowledgement that the plantation owner recognized Marcus as a threat, but could not articulate what kind of threat or how to neutralize it through normal means. And Marcus understood something else as well, that the dogs had witnessed this punishment, had heard his breathing and smelled his blood, and that this experience would only strengthen the bond he had been building with them through his midnight lessons in loyalty and choice. The network expands. Marcus's plan had never been about Thornfield alone. Through the invisible networks that connected enslaved people across plantations, through stolen conversations at Sunday gatherings, through coded messages passed by workers hired out to neighboring estates, through the careful trust built over months of whispered meetings. He had been teaching others his methods, how to approach guard dogs without triggering their aggression, how to befriend them with patience and stolen scraps, how to gradually shift their loyalty from masters who beat them when they failed to catch runaways, to workers who offered kindness in a world designed to eliminate it. The network had begun forming months before Marcus arrived at Thornfield, during his time at the Morrison plantation outside Savannah. There he had befriended an enslaved blacksmith named Isaiah, who traveled between plantations repairing tools and equipment. Isaiah had access that field workers could never achieve, legitimate reasons to move across property boundaries, opportunities to carry messages that would have been impossible for others to deliver. Through Isaiah, Marcus had made contact with enslaved workers on 7 different estates, each one carefully selected for their intelligence, discretion, and willingness to take enormous risks for a chance at undermining the system that held them captive. The teaching process required extraordinary caution. Marcus could not simply explain his methods in direct conversation, as any enslaved person caught discussing ways to subvert plantation security would face torture and execution. Instead, he had developed a system of coded language embedded in seemingly innocent discussions about animal husbandry and farming. When he spoke about gentling a difficult mule, he was actually describing techniques for calming aggressive dogs. When he mentioned teaching a calf to follow, he was explaining how to build trust with animals trained to attack. The code was sophisticated enough to pass unnoticed by white overseers who might overhear fragments of conversation, but clear enough that those who needed to understand could extract the actual meaning. By the spring of 1849, at least 15 enslaved workers across eastern Georgia had begun implementing Marcus's methods with the hunting dogs on their respective plantations. Each one worked slowly and carefully, spending months building relationships with animals that had been trained to view them as prey. They shared food from their already inadequate rations, visited kennels during the night hours when surveillance was minimal, and gradually taught the dogs that loyalty could be chosen rather than compelled. The progress was incremental, nearly invisible to those who were not watching for it, but the cumulative effect was a quiet revolution in the relationship between the enslaved and the instruments used to keep them in bondage. The network also served another crucial purpose: coordination. Marcus understood that isolated incidents of dog failure would be dismissed as training problems or individual animal defects. But a pattern of failures across multiple plantations within a compressed time frame would create the kind of fear among slaveholders that could not be easily explained away or ignored. Fear was itself a weapon, Marcus had learned. The same fear that plantation owners wielded against enslaved people could be turned back against them, creating psychological instability that undermined their certainty about the permanence of their power. Communication across the network required patience and careful timing. Messages passed through Sunday church gatherings where enslaved people from different plantations were occasionally allowed to congregate. Information traveled through workers hired out to perform temporary labor on neighboring estates. Isaiah's blacksmithing work provided cover for longer conversations and more detailed exchanges. And gradually, over months of careful coordination, Marcus and his collaborators agreed on a timeline. The attacks would begin in early June, targeting plantation owners who were known for particular cruelty, who relied most heavily on their dogs to maintain control, whose humiliation or injury would send the strongest possible message that the system they had built was not as secure as they believed. The Cartwright Incident. The first actual attack occurred at Cartwright Plantation on June 3, 1849. Samuel Cartwright, a man who prided himself on his scientific approach to slave management, was found in his study at dawn with injuries to both hands that would leave him permanently unable to write or hold a weapon. His two mastiffs, animals he had trained personally to attack on command, had systematically disabled him while somehow knowing exactly where to stop before causing fatal damage. The dogs were shot by the overseer who found the scene, eliminating the only witnesses who could have explained what had truly happened. Samuel Cartwright had been awake past midnight, as was his habit, reviewing ledgers that documented every aspect of his plantation's operations. He kept meticulous records of cotton production, labor efficiency, punishment frequency, and what he termed breeding outcomes. The birth rates among enslaved women, which he tracked with the same attention he gave to his livestock. Cartwright believed that slavery could be perfected through careful measurement and scientific method, that the application of rational principles would maximize productivity, while minimizing the costs associated with escaped or rebellious property. His study was on the ground floor of his substantial home, a room lined with bookshelves containing volumes on agricultural science, animal husbandry, and racial theory imported from Europe. A single lamp burned on his desk, casting shadows that moved when the flame flickered in drafts from the imperfectly sealed windows. Outside, his two mastiffs patrolled the grounds as they did every night, their massive forms moving through darkness with the confidence of animals that had never encountered anything they could not intimidate or destroy. What Cartwright did not know was that his stable hand, a man named Thomas who had been part of Marcus's network for 3 months, had been working with the mastiffs since February. Thomas had learned the dogs' patrol patterns, discovered their individual personalities beneath the aggression they had been trained to display, and gradually built relationships through the same patient methods Marcus had taught. The dogs had learned to trust Thomas, to see him as a source of unexpected kindness in their otherwise brutal existence, and to respond to commands he gave in the soft vocalizations that only they could fully understand. On the night of June 3rd, Thomas approached the study window from outside, moving with the careful silence that enslaved people learned when their survival depended on being able to navigate white spaces without detection. He carried nothing that would mark him as a threat. No weapons, no tools, nothing but his knowledge of the dogs and his willingness to take a risk that could cost him his life. He made a specific sound, barely audible to human ears, a signal he had taught the mastiffs over months of midnight training. The dogs came to him immediately, abandoning their patrol routes, and he led them to the study door. What happened inside the study lasted perhaps 3 minutes. The dogs entered through the door that Thomas opened with a key he had stolen and copied months earlier. They approached Cartwright at his desk, moving with coordinated precision that suggested careful planning rather than animal rage. When Cartwright reached for the pistol, he kept in his desk drawer. The larger mastiff caught his right hand in its jaws, applying pressure calibrated to crush bones without severing arteries. When Cartwright tried to fight back with his left hand, the second mastiff disabled it with the same terrible precision. The dogs then retreated, leaving Cartwright conscious but permanently maimed, his hands destroyed beyond any surgeon's ability to repair. Pattern recognition. By mid-June, 6 more incidents had occurred across eastern Georgia, each following a similar pattern. Plantation owners attacked in their homes or offices during the dark hours before dawn. Injuries severe enough to disable but not kill. Dogs that had previously been reliable instruments of terror now refusing to obey anyone except, witnesses suggested, certain enslaved workers who seemed to exert an inexplicable influence over them. The white community began to panic, organizing emergency meetings, comparing notes, searching desperately for the common thread that connected these seemingly random acts of violence. The second attack came on June 7th at the Henderson plantation, where Benjamin Henderson lost the use of his right leg when his bloodhounds cornered him in his bedroom and methodically destroyed the tendons behind his knee. The third followed 2 days later at Riverside Estate, where Robert Cunningham's arm required amputation after his own guard dogs held him for hours in his stable, their teeth applying steady pressure that caused irreversible damage to muscle and nerve. By June 15th, 3 more plantation owners had been attacked, and the pattern had become impossible to ignore or dismiss as coincidence. The plantation owners convened an emergency meeting at the county courthouse on June 18th, gathering in the same room where they typically met to discuss cotton prices and coordinate responses to abolition agitation from the North. But the mood this time was different, charged with a fear that most of them had never experienced. The fear that comes from realizing that the tools of your power have been turned against you, that the system you believed was impregnable has vulnerabilities you never anticipated. Colonel Harrison Thornfield chaired the meeting, though his authority had been significantly diminished by the failure of his dogs during the demonstration and by the fact that his plantation had not yet been targeted. Some attendees whispered that Thornfield had somehow been spared because he was cooperating with whatever dark forces were orchestrating these attacks, a rumor that had no basis in fact but reflected the paranoid thinking that was spreading through the white community like contagion. The plantation owners compared notes, looking for connections. All of the attacked men owned significant numbers of enslaved people, between 150 and 300 each. All relied heavily on hunting dogs to maintain security and pursue runaways. All had reputations for particular severity in their treatment of enslaved workers, though in the moral framework of Georgia Plantation Society in 1849, severity was considered prudent management rather than cruelty. But beyond these general similarities, no clear pattern emerged that could explain why these specific men had been targeted, while others remained untouched. Several theories were proposed. Some believed the attacks were coordinated by Northern abolitionists who had infiltrated the region and were using some kind of training method to turn the dogs against their masters. Others insisted it must be the work of enslaved people who possessed African knowledge of animal control, supernatural abilities that white Christians could not understand or counter. A few suggested that the dogs themselves had somehow become infected with a disease that affected their behavior, making them turn on those they should naturally obey. But none of these theories could fully account for the precision of the attacks, the fact that the dogs injured but did not kill, the sense that these were not random acts of violence but carefully planned operations designed to send a specific message. The meeting concluded with several resolutions. Additional, slave patrols would be organized to monitor movement between plantations. Rewards would be offered for information about anyone, enslaved or free, black or white, who had been observed acting suspiciously around hunting dogs. Professional slave catchers from South Carolina would be hired to investigate the incidents and identify the perpetrators. And most significantly, several plantation owners announced they would destroy their hunting dogs entirely, preferring to operate without this particular form of security, rather than risk keeping animals they could no longer trust. The slave catchers. Responding to the growing crisis, a coalition of plantation owners hired professional slave catchers from South Carolina, men who specialized in tracking runaways and suppressing uprisings. These men brought their own dogs, animals they claimed were trained beyond the capability of any enslaved person to subvert. They arrived at Thornfield in late June with their bloodhounds and their rifles, and their absolute certainty that they would identify the ringleaders within days. Marcus watched them arrive from the cotton fields, his face showing nothing, his mind already calculating how their dogs' behavior differed from local breeds and what that would require to turn them. The slave catchers were led by a man named Cyrus Blackwood, who had earned a reputation throughout the Deep South for his success in tracking runaways and his willingness to use whatever methods were necessary to extract information from enslaved people suspected of involvement in escape attempts or rebellions. Blackwood traveled with two associates, his younger brother Nathan and a man named Virgil Kane, whose scarred face and missing left ear testified to the violence of his profession. Together they represented the kind of specialized brutality that plantation owners could hire when their own overseers proved insufficient for particular challenges. The men arrived at Thornfield on June 24th, their wagon loaded with equipment that marked them as professionals in their grim trade. Iron chains and manacles for restraining prisoners, tracking gear including compasses, lanterns, and detailed maps of the region, medical supplies for treating injuries, their own and those of the dogs they relied upon, and weapons, rifles, pistols, knives, and whips of various designs, each suited to specific purposes. They set up their base of operations in one of Thornfield's tobacco barns, converting it into a temporary headquarters from which they would conduct their investigation. Blackwood's dogs were different from the plantation bloodhounds that Marcus had been working with. These animals had been trained exclusively for tracking, and had never been kept on a single plantation long enough to form relationships with enslaved workers. They lived on the road, traveling constantly with their handlers, fed only enough to maintain working condition, and socialized only with each other and with Blackwood and his men. Their entire existence revolved around pursuit, and they had tracked hundreds of runaways across Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi over the past decade. On their first full day at Thornfield, Blackwood interviewed Colonel Thornfield, James Whitmore, and Silas Webb, taking detailed notes about the dog's behavior, the failed demonstration, and any enslaved workers who had shown unusual interest in or aptitude with animals. Marcus's name came up repeatedly, particularly from Webb, who remained convinced that the new field hand possessed some form of supernatural influence over the plantation's hunting pack. Blackwood listened carefully, his expression revealing nothing, but he marked Marcus in his notebook with a symbol that indicated priority for investigation. The interrogations began that afternoon. Blackwood had enslaved workers brought to the tobacco barn, one at a time, where he questioned them about their knowledge of dogs, their observations of unusual behavior, their awareness of any plots or conspiracies involving the plantation's security. Most knew nothing and could say nothing. A few who resisted questioning were subjected to methods that left them injured and traumatized, but still possessing no information that Blackwood could use. The slave catcher was thorough and patient, understanding that breaking through the wall of silence that protected enslaved communities required persistence and the willingness to make examples that would terrify others into cooperation. Marcus was summoned to the tobacco barn near sunset on June 25th. He entered the dim space to find Blackwood seated behind a makeshift desk, Nathan and Virgil standing to either side, and 4 bloodhounds chained in the corner, watching with the focused attention of animals trained to evaluate potential prey. Blackwood studied Marcus in silence for nearly a minute before speaking, his eyes moving from Marcus's face to his hands to his posture, reading what he could from physical presentation. 15. The interrogation. Marcus was among the first enslaved workers the slave catchers questioned, pulled from the fields and brought to the barn where interrogations were conducted with methods designed to break will and extract confessions. They accused him directly of orchestrating the attacks, of using African magic or secret knowledge to corrupt good Christian dogs into instruments of rebellion. But Marcus said nothing except to deny knowledge of anything beyond his daily labor. And when they brought their bloodhounds to intimidate him, the dogs became calm in his presence, refusing to bark or growl, sitting patiently, as if waiting for instructions only they could hear. Cyrus Blackwood began with questions delivered in a conversational tone that suggested he was simply gathering information rather than conducting an interrogation. He asked Marcus about his previous owners, the plantations where he had worked, his skills and training, his family, connections. Marcus answered each question truthfully where truth posed no danger, understanding that lies could be checked against bills of sale and plantation records. He had worked at Morrison Plantation, yes. Before that, at Cunningham Estate. He had no wife, no children that he knew of. He was trained for field work and had no particular skills beyond those required for cotton cultivation. Blackwood's questions gradually became more pointed. Had Marcus been present during any incidents involving dogs at his previous plantations? Had he observed unusual behavior among the animals? Did he know of any enslaved workers who possessed knowledge of animal training or control? Marcus maintained his careful responses, admitting to nothing that could be construed as suspicious while avoiding denials so absolute they might seem dishonest. He had seen dogs. Yes, as all enslaved workers saw dogs. He had no knowledge of animal training. He knew nothing about the incidents that had brought Blackwood to Thornfield. When conversation failed to produce useful information, Blackwood shifted to intimidation. He described in detail what happened to enslaved people who were caught participating in conspiracies or uprisings. The torture, the executions, the practice of displaying mutilated bodies as warnings to others who might consider similar actions. He spoke in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that made his descriptions more chilling than any theatrical displays of anger would have achieved. Marcus listened without visible reaction, his face maintaining the careful neutrality he had perfected over years of surviving in a system designed to destroy any sense of autonomous selfhood. Blackwood nodded to his brother Nathan, who moved to the corner and unchained the 4 bloodhounds. The dogs rose, stretching, their attention immediately drawn to Marcus as the most interesting stimulus in the barn. Nathan led them across the dirt floor, allowing them to approach Marcus from multiple angles, expecting them to show the aggression that properly trained hunting dogs should display toward an enslaved person being interrogated for serious offenses. But instead, the dogs became remarkably calm. Their tails began to wave gently. The lead male, a massive animal named Caesar that Blackwood claimed had tracked over 200 runaways, approached Marcus directly and sat at his feet, looking up at him with what could only be described as friendly attention. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He had seen many things in his years as a slave catcher. Runaways who fought with desperate courage, enslaved people who betrayed each other to save themselves, acts of violence and sacrifice that most white Southerners preferred not to acknowledge. But he had never seen his dogs react to an interrogation subject with anything approaching the behavior they were displaying toward Marcus. He stood, circling around his desk, studying Marcus from a new angle as if hoping a different perspective would reveal something he had missed. "You have a way with dogs," Blackwood said finally. It was not a question but a statement of observed fact. Marcus did not respond, understanding that silence could not be twisted into confession the way words could be. Blackwood continued, "The question, is whether that way comes from experience or from something else, something darker. He paused, watching Marcus's face for any reaction. I've hunted a lot of men, boy, and I've learned that the ones who can stay calm when my dogs surround them are usually the ones with the most to hide. Marcus met Blackwood's gaze steadily, a risk that could be interpreted as insubordination, but one that he calculated was necessary to maintain his position. I have nothing to hide, he said quietly. I work in the fields. I follow orders. I cause no trouble. The words were true in their literal meaning, while being completely false in their implication, a type of verbal resistance that required extraordinary care to execute successfully. The breaking point. Colonel Thornfield's patience finally expired on July 12th, when his own dogs refused to attack a runaway who had been caught and returned to the plantation. The failure occurred in front of witnesses, enslaved workers, and white overseers alike, and it represented a complete breakdown of the psychological warfare that undergirded the entire system. If dogs would not hunt enslaved people, if they would not attack on command, if they could be turned against their masters, then the fiction of white supremacy's natural order revealed itself as exactly that, a fiction maintained only through violence and the threat of violence. The runaway was a man named Jacob, 32 years old, who had attempted to reach Savannah's docks. He had been caught after 2 days by a patrol, returned in chains with bleeding feet and a swollen face from beatings administered during his capture. Colonel Thornfield ordered a public punishment designed to terrorize any other enslaved workers who might consider similar attempts at freedom. Jacob was to be whipped, then released with a 15-minute head start before being hunted by the plantation's full pack of dogs. The enslaved workers were assembled near the kennels, required to witness what awaited anyone who dared seek freedom. White overseers and neighboring plantation owners gathered on a raised platform. Silas Webb prepared the 5 most aggressive dogs, animals with proven records of pursuing human targets. The air was thick with the particular silence that comes when people are forced to watch suffering they are powerless to prevent. Jacob received his initial whipping, 10 lashes that opened bleeding wounds but left him capable of running. He stumbled into the forest on damaged feet, knowing survival was impossible, but unable to stop himself from trying. The 15 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Colonel Thornfield consulted his pocket watch repeatedly, drawing out the weight to maximize psychological impact. When time expired, he nodded to Silas Webb. Webb released the 5 dogs, expecting them to surge forward with the eagerness they had shown in dozens of previous hunts. Instead, they sat down in perfect coordination, as if responding to a command no one present had given. Webb shouted at them, cracked his whip, physically pushed the lead dog forward. The animals remained motionless, their attention focused on Marcus, who stood among the assembled enslaved workers, his face showing nothing but neutral expression. Colonel Thornfield descended from the platform, drew his pistol, and fired a shot into the air above the dogs' heads. The explosion should have startled them into action, but the dogs did not move. They had made their choice, following training and loyalty that superseded years of brutal conditioning. In that moment, in front of dozens of witnesses, the system revealed its fundamental vulnerability. The instruments of control had learned to refuse. The failed execution. In desperation, Thornfield ordered Marcus's execution to be carried out publicly as a warning to anyone else who might consider similar acts of resistance. Marcus was to be hanged at dawn on July 15th, with all enslaved workers required to witness. But the night before the scheduled execution, something remarkable occurred. Every dog on Thornfield Estate, including those belonging to neighboring plantations who had brought their animals for added security, broke free from their kennels and chains. They did not attack anyone, did not cause chaos. They simply surrounded the shed where Marcus was being held, sitting in a silent vigil that made his execution impossible. The decision to execute Marcus had been made in the aftermath of Jacob's successful escape. Colonel Thornfield understood that allowing Marcus to live would suggest to enslaved workers throughout the region that resistance was possible. The execution was scheduled quickly, with minimal formal process, justified under plantation law that gave owners nearly absolute authority over their human property. Marcus was confined in a storage shed behind the main barn, his wrists chained to iron rings set into the wall. 2 white overseers guarded the shed in shifts. The gallows were constructed in the area where public punishments typically occurred, a crude platform with a rope already measured and knotted. Everything was prepared for an execution at first light. But at midnight on July 14th, the dogs began their escape. The hunting dogs in the main kennel somehow opened the latch mechanism that should have kept them confined. Guard dogs near the main house broke their chains with coordinated pulling that suggested deliberate planning. Within an hour, every canine on Thornfield Estate had joined the growing pack, moving toward the shed where Marcus was held. The night guards watched with mounting terror as nearly 20 animals assembled. The dogs did not bark or show aggression. They simply sat in concentric circles around the shed, their attention focused inward, their presence making it impossible for anyone to approach without walking through a living barrier whose intentions were unclear but whose size and number made them impossible to ignore. James Whitmore was awakened around 2 in the morning and came to investigate with a lantern and rifle. The animals paid him no attention, did not respond when he called commands, did not move when he fired a warning shot. They were engaged in something that transcended their normal behavior, something that fell outside the categories Whitmore's experience had prepared him to understand. By dawn, a crowd had gathered. Enslaved workers ordered to witness the hanging, white overseers supposed to conduct it, and Colonel Thornfield himself standing before this impossible situation. The dogs maintained their vigil, unmoving and silent, protecting Marcus through their mere presence. The standoff continued throughout July 15th with various strategies proposed, but none implemented successfully. The escape. The details of Marcus's escape were never fully documented because those who might have witnessed it refused to speak, and those who investigated it later found only contradictions and impossibilities. What is known is that on the morning of July 16th, the shed where Marcus had been imprisoned stood empty. The door remained locked from the outside. The windows were too small for a man of his size to fit through. And every dog that had kept vigil through the night was gone, vanished into the pine forest that surrounded Thornfield Estate. The discovery was made at first light by James Whitmore, who swore in his later testimony that no one had approached the building during the night, that the door had remained locked, that the dogs had simply stood as one just before dawn and moved into the forest, like water flowing around an obstacle. When Whitmore unlocked the door, he found only empty chains and a small pile of tools, a thin piece of metal that could have been used to pick locks, some twine, and a wooden handle. The investigation produced more questions than answers. The locks showed signs of tampering, but had not been broken by force. The walls were intact, with no evidence of tunneling or structural damage. The guards had heard nothing unusual, seen no movement, observed no rescue attempt. One young guard claimed he had seen Marcus walk through the locked door as if it did not exist, though he later recanted this statement under questioning. Cyrus Blackwood conducted his own investigation, bringing his specialized tracking skills to the search. His bloodhounds circled the shed repeatedly without identifying a clear direction of travel. When Blackwood forced them to commit to a trail, they followed it for perhaps a quarter mile before losing the scent entirely at a creek. Despite 2 days of systematic searching, Blackwood's dogs could find no further trace of Marcus. The white community responded with fury and fear. Slave patrols were doubled throughout eastern Georgia. Rewards were posted for information leading to Marcus's capture, eventually reaching $500, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the threat he represented and the desperation of plantation owners. Every enslaved person connected to Marcus was interrogated, some with methods that left them permanently injured. But no useful information emerged. The conspiracy of silence was absolute. Colonel Thornfield sold 15 of his remaining enslaved workers to buyers from the Deep South, breaking up families as punishment by proxy. He also ordered the destruction of all remaining dogs on his plantation, shooting them himself, in a rage witnesses described as bordering on madness. If he could not trust the animals, he would rather operate without them than risk further betrayal. The aftermath. The summer of 1849 became known in Eastern Georgia Plantation Society as the Season of Disobedience, though that genteel term barely captured the terror that gripped slaveholders throughout the region. Guard dog breeding programs were abandoned. Training methods were questioned. Some plantation owners freed their dogs entirely, rather than risk keeping animals they could no longer trust. And though Marcus was never captured, reports of his presence continued to surface across Georgia, Alabama, and eventually as far as Tennessee, always accompanied by stories of dogs that refused to hunt. The immediate economic impact was substantial. Plantation owners who had invested thousands of dollars in breeding and training hunting dogs found their investments worthless overnight. Without reliable dogs, the rate of successful escapes increased dramatically. In the 6 months following Marcus's escape, documented runaways in eastern Georgia increased by 43% according to newspaper reports, though the actual number was likely higher as many owners chose not to report escapes that might suggest their inability to maintain proper control. Insurance companies that had offered policies protecting against enslaved workers' escape began refusing to write new contracts for Georgia plantations or demanded premium increases so substantial that many owners could not afford coverage. This financial pressure created a cascading effect throughout the plantation economy. Some smaller plantations, already operating on narrow profit margins, were forced to sell land or consolidate with larger operations to remain economically viable. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the economic consequences. For decades, the plantation system had relied on the mythology of white supremacy's natural order, the belief that some people were born to rule and others born to serve, that this arrangement reflected divine will and natural law. Marcus's success in turning the instruments of control against their masters shattered this mythology in ways that no abolitionist pamphlet or slave revolt had achieved. Reports of Marcus's continued activity appeared throughout late 1849 and into 1850. In September, a plantation owner in Alabama reported that his dogs had released a captured runaway. In November, a Kentucky planter wrote about an enslaved man matching Marcus's description near his property, shortly before his hunting dogs became unaccountably docile. By early 1850, Marcus had become a legendary figure, though white and black communities understood his legend in radically different ways. To white plantation owners, Marcus represented a nightmare scenario, the possibility that enslaved people possessed knowledge their masters could not counter. To enslaved people throughout the South, Marcus became a figure of hope and inspiration, proof that resistance could succeed even against overwhelming power. Stories about him circulated in the quarters, told in whispers that could not be stopped by any amount of surveillance or punishment. The legacy Catherine Kellerman, reading about these incidents years later while researching her own testimony about plantation cruelty, found correspondence between Georgia plantation owners and Mississippi families discussing the dog problem. Some letters suggested that Marcus had been killed by slave catchers in 1851. Others claimed he had reached free territory in Canada, accompanied by a pack of formerly enslaved animals that had chosen his leadership over their master's commands. The truth, as with so many acts of resistance that history tried to erase, remains unknowable. But what endures is the lesson Marcus taught. that the tools of oppression could be turned against their wielders, that loyalty was not ownership, and that even in a system designed to eliminate all agency, the determined and clever could find ways to strike back. The historical record regarding Marcus's ultimate fate contains multiple conflicting accounts, none definitively proven. A slave catcher's journal from 1851 contains a brief entry claiming a man matching Marcus's description was tracked to a Georgia swamp and killed while resisting capture. But the entry provides no physical evidence and contradicts other accounts placing Marcus in different locations during the same period. More hopeful narratives appear in oral histories collected from formerly enslaved people during the 1930s. Several elderly individuals recalled stories about a man who reached Canada via the Underground Railroad, arriving in Ontario, with several dogs that had traveled the entire journey with him. Whether these stories reflect actual events or represent the kind of hopeful ending communities needed to believe remains uncertain. What is documented beyond dispute is Marcus's impact on plantation security systems. By 1852, a survey revealed that fewer than 30% of Georgia plantation owners still maintain breeding programs for hunting dogs, down from over 75% before the season of disobedience. Agricultural journals contain numerous articles debating the reliability of canine security and proposing alternative methods. Insurance records show sustained increases in escape rates throughout the 1850s. The story also influenced abolitionist literature. Frederick Douglass referenced the incidents in an 1852 speech, using them as evidence that enslaved people possessed intelligence that white supremacist ideology denied. Harriet Beecher Stowe incorporated elements into later editions of Uncle Tom's Cabin. These retellings spread Marcus's legend beyond the South, making him a symbol of resistance for audiences who might never meet an enslaved person, but could understand the image of a man who turned his oppressors' weapons against them. What remains beyond historical debate is the lesson Marcus's story teaches about power, loyalty, and the brittleness of systems built on violence. He demonstrated that authority based solely on force was inherently unstable, that intelligent resistance could find vulnerabilities in seemingly impenetrable systems, and that even instruments designed to prevent freedom could be taught to serve freedom's cause.